You named me Ella, and that was a beautiful word to be called. With hand-carved arms and a manufactured head, I was made for little girls like you. But you aren't a little girl anymore, and that's why I no longer see you. I strived to grow, to develop, to age as you did. But what can I do when you've matured beyond the need for childish things? It is upsetting how years can change a person, especially someone like you. I remember swinging in your arms the first day we met and feeling your heart beat more times than I could count. When you held me tight during those awful, thunderous nights, I could pretend that it was my heart beating too. And the safety of those warm blankets and hugs that saw us through to the morning without those horrible nightmares of yours. I know how much they frightened you, and if I could smile, you could have seen how I loved to be your miniature guardian. I often wonder if you recall those nights, if it pleases you at all to travel back in time and relive those memories as I do every day. Being a grown-up must be very tough. You don't seem to have any time to play anymore. In fact, it's been nearly 3 years since you last opened this bag. I miss seeing you. You don't even stop to wipe the dust off me anymore, and it's starting to build. Was it something that I did to upset you? I can't think of what it would be. I'm a terrific listener, and your secrets are always safe with me. If I ever hurt you, I am truly sorry. But I believe it is you that has hurt me, and I don't get an apology, which is okay. But I could really use you right now to share the little bit of Sophie time that only I got to experience. Moments that I still hold dear to my hollow chest and cherish. Pig seems to be doing well. He doesn't appear to mind the silence. You know what he's like, though. Always was one to stay in the corner while the others had fun. I think he was more obsessed with counting his coins than playtime. Sheep isn't holding us strong. She and Dino were arguing the other day about ripping open this thin plastic bag and coming to see you personally. But I reminded them that we shouldn't. Although we could if we wanted to. You didn't make this abyss very secure, you know, and some of us aren't so patient. You were 14 years old when we last spoke. The events of that day still project themselves onto the nothing that I have to see with each awakening. Though, truth be told, we never really went to sleep when you did. I can't close my eyes. Neither can Pig, Sheep, or Dino. But our painted eyes eventually became accustomed to the void that envelops our entire existence. And in my more saneless nights, I see you there in front of me, dancing and skipping and singing. How exceptional you were at singing at such a young age. Karaoke night was a favorite of mine, and Dino's too. Sheep could never quite get that stutter under control. It's a shame that you stopped using your voice like that. I may be in the attic, but I would know when my Sophie was singing. You made us all so proud. I've heard that you aren't doing so well in school anymore. What happened? Last I saw you, a future of being a teacher was sparkling in your eye. Or was it an actress? Or a model? You were going to be so many things. We all believed in you. Pig would have tippled on his plump side with all the coins you presented to him, and Sheep, Dino, and I would have enjoyed just watching the world by your side. It is strange that you seem to lose interest in a lot of subjects around the same time. Not just with me. What is it with growing up that you all crave so much? Why can't you remain the same as we do? It doesn't look like a whole lot of fun to be a teenager. Something you repeatedly whispered to me that you couldn't wait to be. But how fun would it be for you to join us in this bag, even just for a day? Maybe forever. I don't have much for us to do in terms of games, but we all enjoy a good chat in the middle of the night. Mainly about you. Maybe you've heard us. I'm not sure if your eyes would adjust to being in this darkness. Ours haven't. But your vision will be better, I think. It could be even better again if you always kept them open like we do. Just thinking about you being in here with us is making me giddy. Butterflies, Sophie. They're called butterflies. I remember you telling me this and thinking it was so silly, but that's what they are, I suppose. And I don't get them when I think of anyone else. I don't really feel them at all when I'm not thinking of you. I was asked the other day from a particularly sad sheep. Ella, what will we do if one day she really does come back? How do we act? What do we say? I feel like I want to cry just thinking about it. And I answered her honestly, I don't know. After the first few months, I never had a positive thought about my future with you again. So it was a little bit out of the blue when she brought up a scenario to me, which I hadn't considered in years. She is always the optimist, though, and I usually partake in her unrealistic hopes. Because it doesn't cost a thing to be kind, Sophie. And making her happy makes me happy in turn. But something about that question churned in my lumbar and stuck to my empty head, and for once, I snapped. I never thought it would be me that had to say goodbye, sheep. She's older now and has no use for things such as us. I want to wait here, right here where she left us, in case she ever got scared and wanted to return even just for a little playtime when she needed it most in her stressful adult life. But I'm not expecting much from her anymore. I know Sophie is older, but so am I. The problem is, she can move on, but I cannot. Sheep turned her back to her side of the black and began to cry. I shouldn't have been so blunt with her, but it is really because of you that this is happening. I felt Dino raise a tiny arm and place it over Sheep's now ragged and filthy wool, consoling her as he has done on so many occasions. And to my left, I touched a familiar object of something long and sharp. I don't know what they're called, but I know what they're used for. And a devious thought now washed over me. A thought that has plagued me for some time now. I turned to face Dino and Sheep, my pencil-straight lips now able to curve, and said with a joyous affliction, "You know what? You were right. Let's pay her a visit." My grandmother came to live with us when I was 12. She wasn't ill, but at 89, my mother didn't want her to live alone anymore. When my mom wasn't there, a caretaker would help during the day. On Saturday afternoons, while my mom did her shopping, I would watch Grandma. She was a kind and cheerful lady, and would often tell me stories about her childhood. During this particular week, I had taken a book out of the library called Tales of Terror. That Saturday afternoon, we were in the living room folding a basket of clean clothes, when I happened to ask her, "What's the scariest thing you can remember?" She paused, sitting back in her chair, and then slowly spoke. "When I was a girl not much older than you, we lived in a small village. The only thing remarkable about it was the abbey. It was about 4 miles outside the town, up on a hill. No one knew exactly how old it was, but it looked like it had been there forever. An order of nuns had taken up residence there, and with the help of workmen from the village, they had begun a restoration of sorts. When I turned 14, I was hired to work in the kitchens. The abbey was really the only source of employment for the village, and I was happy to have the work. My job was to clear the tables after the meals, do the dishes, sweep the floors. Most days I would quickly finish the dishes and use my sweeping as a reason to explore. The massive stone entry opened onto what was called the Great Hall, with several large rooms off to each side. This section was in fairly good condition, and was used to greet important guests. The kitchens and sleeping quarters were on the right, and to the left was the chapel, with a wide stone path that led to the oldest and most dilapidated section of the abbey. This was, of course, the part that I was most curious about. As the weeks passed, I took notice that every day at noon, a small plate of food was prepared and taken out of the kitchen and through the courtyard. It was then handed to the Mother Abbess. She, and only she, would carry the dish past the chapel and down the shaded path to the oldest part of the abbey. She would return in 20 minutes or so, and then retire immediately to her room above the dining hall. The Mother Abbess was quite old and very strict, and I tried my best to keep out of her way. I did my work and took pride in a job well done. Things went along well this way until late September of my first year there. 2 of the nuns became ill, and then 2 became 4, then 4 became 6. It spread quickly, until the few left that were the healthy spent their days taking care of the sick. I had been asked to do the dishes, and then head home until further notice. They said I would be sent for when the sickness had passed. I finished my work and walked out into what I had never seen before. A completely empty courtyard. Looking down the old stone path, I thought, this might be my only chance. I took a quick glance around and then moved into the cool shadows of the walkway. I hurried up several steps and into the old wing of the abbey. Outside it was early afternoon, but in the dark stone hallway it was twilight. Here it was completely silent. I could hear my footsteps echo as I stepped slowly down the hall. The passage went on for a while, and it ended at the base of a narrow stairwell. Going up, I felt the curving stone walls with my hand. At the top of the stairs, the hall branched out into 3 directions. I paused and considered retreating, starting to become worried I would get lost. That was when I saw the footsteps, clearly marked in the thick dust of the floor. I followed them. They led down the hallway to the left, and up a hallway so narrow that only one person could fit. At the top was a landing with 2 heavy oak doors on either side, directly opposite of each other. The doors each had a small barred window about 12 inches wide. Then I heard the whispering. It was a constant volley of words spoken with urgency. I crept closer to the door to see if I could understand, but the words seemed to connect together, making some other language foreign to me. I don't know what possessed me, but I inched toward the bars. I had to see what was inside. Peeking through them, I only saw darkness. As my eyes adjusted, though, I started to make out a small figure. I could see a woman. It was difficult to see in the darkness, but she looked to be turned away from me. Her long hair was matted and unkempt, and she was whispering in a feverish pitch. It was then that something soft brushed against my ankle, and I fell back against the door with a scream. Something dark jumped away from me. Looking down, I was relieved to see that it was just the abbey cat. He must have followed me from the kitchen looking for something to eat. Standing back up, I brushed the dust from my clothes, and then noticed the whispering had stopped. I turned around slowly and saw her face was inches from mine. Her eyes were solid white, and I was so close that I could see tiny red veins running through them. She must have been blind, but it wasn't just her eyes. Before I fainted, I saw that she was grinning at me, and I heard her whisper 3 words. "You are mine." Those 3 words haunted my every waking moment. It would be fair to say that I thought of nothing else for weeks. Whenever I asked my grandmother what it meant, she would only shake her head and say, "I don't like to think about it." After a while, I noticed that she was becoming visibly upset, so I stopped asking. Eventually, I came to think of it as just a story she had heard. A story that had somehow grown into reality and mixed itself into her memories. Years went by and I went off to college. My grandmother, now in her 90s, was still able to get around, but had been diagnosed with dementia. There were good days and bad, but the days when her memory was vivid grew few and far between. My mom had retired, so she was able to become a full-time caregiver, and every once in a while, my grandma would wander away. My mother would find her 6 houses down, contentedly talking to a neighbor. I came home to help whenever I could. It was difficult, but things were manageable, that is, until last week. It was Monday morning, and it looked to be a beautiful summer day. My mom had settled my grandmother in the backyard and was in between doing the laundry and breakfast dishes. She had just come up from the basement when, glancing out the back window, she realized that my grandma was gone. Quickly heading out the back door, my mother checked the yard, the path around the garage, the driveway before heading to the front sidewalk. Looking up and down the street, she saw nothing. Beginning to worry now, she enlisted a few neighbors to help with the search. They knocked on every door and checked every single backyard. It was over an hour later when they found her. She was 3 streets over in an old cemetery, but she wasn't looking at the graves. She was backed up against an old oak tree, staring terror-stricken at the cross over the entry of a church. My mother tried to calm her down, but my grandma didn't seem to hear or see anything else. She just kept staring at the church, holding the cross at her neck, and chanting incomprehensible words over and over. My mother called an ambulance, and then she called me. It took me 3 hours to drive home, and I went straight to the hospital. I found my mom pacing back and forth at the window. She looked exhausted. She said that my grandmother hadn't spoken or even opened her eyes since arriving at the hospital. I convinced my mom to go home and get some rest. I told her that I would stay there with Grandma, and promised to call if anything changed. Sometime after midnight, I must have closed my eyes for a moment, because the next thing I remember was someone quietly calling my name. Chris. Grandma, you all right? I'll get the doctor, I said. But as I moved to get up from the chair, she had put her hand softly on my arm. No, she said quietly. I'm all right, just give me a moment. I asked her if she wanted some water. She nodded, so I poured her a glass from the bedside pitcher. Slowly sipping at the water, she glanced from me to the window and back. Chris, she said quietly, I need to tell you something about what happened at the abbey. Graham, you should be resting, I said. There will be plenty of time for resting soon enough, she replied. I started to object, but she shook her head defiantly. Looking her straight in the eyes, I could see that she was fully awake and aware, maybe for the first time in a long time. So I nodded. She began right where she left off all those years ago. After I found the woman in the locked room, or the thing that had taken the form of a woman, I fainted. When I regained my senses, I was standing in a large chamber on the first floor of the abbey. It was the room they used to care for the sick. Beds lined the walls. The nuns had fallen ill were kept there. At first, I thought they were sleeping. Then I noticed their eyes, unblinking, staring out into nothingness. Bordering on hysteria now, I ran from bed to bed, but was only met with the same glassy stare. Raising my hand to stiffen a scream, I saw that both of my hands were covered in blood. All I could do was stand frozen, looking down in shock. I felt something forceful clamp down on my shoulder, and it spun me around strongly, and I found myself face to face with the Mother Abbess, her face twisted in grief and fury. I screamed, and with an iron grip, she half pulled, half dragged me down the hall to her quarters, locking the door behind us. She turned back to me. I tried to speak, but no words would come. Her face softened as she spoke. "It's all right, dear. It's all right. Now you must gather your wits, for we don't have much time." Walking me over to the wash basin, she told me to clean away the blood on my face and hands. Then, she rummaged through a dresser and came back with a long white nightdress. She spoke softly, but with urgency. "Put this on. You must leave here now and never return. Go home to your family and say nothing of any of this. Tell them only that I sent you home, that there's an illness in the abbey," she said. Almost too afraid to ask, I stammered out, Did I? "No, you are innocent. It has the ability to enter a body at will and use the human form like an empty husk. You were powerless to stop it. Do not blame yourself. If anything, the fault is mine. It has been in my charge for more than 50 years. I was careless," the Mother Abbess said. "Is it still with me?" I whispered. "No, my dear. If that were the case, I would not still be among the living. Now you must hurry, but before you go, you must promise me something." It was then she gently removed a silver chain from around her neck, and I saw that it held a very old cross along with a gold medallion of Saint Benedict. Placing it around my neck, she looked at me with the utmost seriousness. "You must promise never to take this off. It will keep you safe. It will keep her from finding you and your family," she said. Unlocking the door, she hurried me down the long hallway to the entrance of the abbey. She stood at the opening and watched as I ran toward the road to the village, until I was out of sight. The next morning I awoke to the sound of shouts and commotion. My mother told me there had been an accident and that the abbey was on fire. More thoughts than you can imagine raced through my mind, and I ran outside to see smoke rising far off in the distance. It took a few days, but when the embers finally cooled, the villagers found that the oldest section of the abbey had burned and collapsed upon itself. They found some human remains in the ruins, even finding the bones of one body in the abbey chapel. The body they found was charred but intact, and I have no way of knowing, but I'm sure it was the Mother Abbess. Released at last from her terrible charge, and I hope she is at peace. As my grandmother finished her story, she reached under the neck of her hospital gown and brought out an old silver chain. She motioned for me to come closer and placed it around my neck. "Here, my love. I won't need this anymore. Promise me. Promise me that you will never take it off." I did what she asked, and as I promised, I saw my grandmother suddenly relax, as if a weight had been lifted, or promise kept. She closed her eyes to rest, and never opened them again. My grandmother passed away quietly, peacefully in her sleep the next day. My mother and I were by her side. I never told my mother the story. I never told anyone until now. I always wear the silver chain. I never take it off. My grandmother kept her promise, and I will keep mine. Have a look here, Murphy. Dr. Abbott said and directed his friend's attention to the open skull sitting in front of him. Do you see how it all appears to be so similar to ours? The shape, the color, nothing has changed. Well, except for the smell. He grabbed Murphy's hand and extended the index finger, pointing it toward the tip of the exposed brain. Go on, have a feel. Murphy gave an uncertain pause but slowly moved his fingertip to the back of the subject's head, touching the jelly-like matter that composed the occipital lobe. Feels weird, doesn't it? I had the same thought when I first touched a brain. Dr. Abbott smiled and leaned over his tray of tools, picking up a long needle with an oddly vibrant purple goop that swished around inside of the vial. Of course, my first time wasn't with a living patient. He extended his toothy grin toward his companion. Living only used as a loose term for this participant, obviously. Murphy stood in silence as he waited for the doctor to prepare his experiment. He looked on as 2 inches of stainless steel squelched into the brain of the living corpse, injected a dosage of that awful ooze into its mind. It's all about where you place it, you see, Dr. Abbott said while carefully extracting the needle. Pouring the mixture into anywhere but here would result in very different outcomes, some not so good. You know that, Murphy, don't you? Murphy began opening his mouth to speak but was given no time. But if we introduce the correct chemicals to just the right part of the cerebrum, magical things can happen. And in saying this, he took the 2 split halves of the rotting skull and forced them carelessly together, closing over the peeled back skin and apathetically stitching it back again. Now watch, Murphy. He pushed aside his tray of utensils and walked in front of the subject with giddiness in his step. He stood a few feet away from the gray and molded form of a human and lifted his hands in the pose of an orchestra conductor. His lips pursed with an upward curve to the corners and majestically said, "Open your eyes." And the participant mindlessly obliged. Voila, my good friend, your very own puppet. Murphy slowly made his way to the front of the room and stood beside Dr. Abbott, staring wide-eyed at the undead creature sitting before him, shackled in old chains, its body motionless and relaxed, but its eyes alert and waiting. "Now," started the doctor, keeping his arms in the conductor position, "I want to see some big smiles. Come on now." He curled the edges of his fingers in an upward motion, and the subject obliged once again. "That's it. Wider. I want to see all those teeth of yours." Dr. Abbott started to mimic the result he was looking for in his participant, and the half-living body was now fully grinning beyond its comprehension. "Good little doll," he uttered with joyous enthusiasm, and returned his arms to his sides. Getting down on his knees, the doctor shuffled toward the experiment. In a childlike manner, he clutched its cheeks in his right hand and turned to Murphy. "Isn't it fascinating, friend? Look at its teeth." And he used his left hand to pry the upper and lower lips wider than they already were. "They're just like ours, only more foul? Would that be the right word, Murphy?" He then inserted his right hand into his pocket and pulled out a small hammer, and with his free hand, still holding apart the creature's lips, began to tap on individual teeth. The effects of dying don't appear to have damaged the structure of its canines or its molars. Write that down, Murphy. As he reached the incisors, he gave them each a delicate tap with the tip of his hammer. Then, with a glint in his eyes, wound back and smashed its front 2 teeth with an excruciating shatter. The subject began to twist and writhe and let out an awful, inhuman mix of gargle and a scream, flailing its arms and legs as much as the chains would allow. Its eyes darted in the direction of Dr. Abbott, and despite its indoctrination, stared with despair and venom. My, fragile little things, aren't they? The doctor started. "I should be more careful next time." And he gave another torturous grin toward his toy. "The participant can feel pain. Write that down." He stood up and briskly walked to his desk, flipping through a pile of papers until he found a blank sheet. "This is going to be big, Murphy. Since the outbreak, there haven't been any real documented studies on the effects that the undead has on a human body." He grabbed a pen out of his top drawer and lay it beside the untouched paper. "There are a few more things we have to test. Murphy watched over the doctor in silence as he bounced from corner to corner of the room, muttering to himself while trying to find a particular item amidst the clutter of his office. "Ah, here it is!" he exclaimed with foreboding happiness, and he lifted above his head an impeccably clean and razor-sharp blade. He thumped his way back to the patient and stared him down menacingly. "There's one thing I've always wanted to test, Murphy," he began, without breaking eye contact with his victim, squatting down low and close to the corpse's face, close enough to feel the hot breath exuding from its mangled nostrils. "I want to know how long it will take for this thing to die again." And his eyes flamed at the prospect. As we've learned from the news several times over, these monsters will die instantly if you cut off their head, or cause enough damage to the brain. Like with any person, right? But if we worked our way around the head, causing potentially fatal wounds one at a time, and started at, the limbs. And he gave another grimacing, toothy smile at his subject's expense. "Murphy, grab that pen and paper and get ready to take notes. I want to start with the arms." Murphy reluctantly complied and shuffled his way over to the desk, giving the creature a sympathetic look as he passed. Dr. Abbott ran a finger over the edge of the acutely tipped knife and took a step back, considering his aim. "Look at the poor thing, Murphy. It fully understands what I'm about to do, but is powerless to do anything but watch." His friend started to look elsewhere, but was instantly scolded. "You must watch this, friend. It's for research purposes." And as the last of those words raged from his lips, he turned back to the tied-up specimen and, with a double-handed swing, cut straight through its decayed right arm. A cacophony of screeches and trills bellowed from the creature's mouth as its leopard-like limb flopped to the floor in anticlimactic fashion. It kicked and bucked and tossed itself around in the small wooden chair of which it was imprisoned, its jaw snapping up and down, straining at the shackles, attempting to leap for the doctor. "Temper, temper," Dr. Abbott said as he picked up the fallen arm and tossed it behind himself. "We shan't be having any of that." Clearing his throat and slicking back what few fray hairs he had left, the doctor walked over to the remnants of the amputated armhole and mercilessly stuck a finger inside the wound. The undead victim expelled under another awful groan and began to breathe heavily in increasingly shortened intervals, its legs jutting up and down from side to side. Note that there is no spurting of blood from the open wound, only a coagulated goop of darkish red that appears to glue itself to the creature's skin. He leaned forward to the sticky mess of innards and ooze and gave a deep, deep sniff. His eyes rolled back, and he licked his lips intimately, the sufferer still slowly rocking in its chair. He turned to Murphy and gave an ogling look of ecstasy and satisfaction, his lips wet with pleasure. "It's putrid, like urine and metal." And he looked once again at his plaything and smirked. "I love it." The doctor then composed himself of twisted lust, and with a wipe of his mouth and a straightening of his tie, he had further experiments to make. "Now," he started, "I don't want to be staring at that ugly face of yours for the entire length of this procedure. Can't you see we're making history?" And he turned to his assistant and back again. "What am I saying? Of course you don't. Look at those vacant eyes. You experience nothing but hunger and pain, don't you?" The creature responded to his rhetoric with a growl and a slight kicking from the chains. He began lifting his arms in that psychotic orchestral position once more and spoke in a grandiose voice. "Well, if you won't change your attitude, then I'll do it for you." And he swung his arms in a hypnotic to and fro. "Smile for me, slave. Grin as wide as you can." The specimen now, through its visible pain and squirming, lifted the edges of its lips so high that its cheeks nearly touched its eyes. the edges of its mouth cracking, with the dead skin and its stiff, decomposed muscles slightly tearing away as it was compelled to raise an embarrassing and agonizing smile, an almost unbearable mask of a face for Murphy to watch. That's it. That's the face I want to see. I want you to enjoy this as much as I do. The doctor cackled with his arms swinging from side to side. Now let's get that other arm. Murphy watched on in appalled silence as the mad Dr. Abbott struck down once more on the terrified subject. His maniacal laughter combined with the disturbing, beaming smile of a creature that was in tremendous pain, and its body thrashed violently as yet another limb bluntly tumbled to the floor. Make that 2 arms and it's still holding strong, remarked the doctor, and he turned to his assistant. I think it has to do something with the complete lack of blood loss it experienced when amputated. He took a step back and looked his victim up and down, its crazed and abused eyes conflicting horrifyingly with its cheek-to-cheek grin. He bent down and collected its second severed appendage and threw it to the back of the room with the other. On to the legs it is, then. Murphy could bear witness to this madness no longer, and headed for the desk where the doctor's main collection of lab equipment sat, including the slave-inducing purple goop. He stood over the cracked wood with his arms firmly gripping the table and faced the dark gray wall. An assortment of hacks and cracks and wails and laughter bellowed from behind him. Are you noting this down, Murphy? But he didn't answer. He merely continued to face the undecorated, boring brick, for it was the only place in the room that didn't make him feel so evil. That although he was not commanding the torture, he also wasn't stopping it. As the minutes passed, minutes which never seemed to end for Murphy as he winced at every high-pitched screech that cried from the undead specimen, a distressed call was met with a squelching ripping of flesh. A bucking against the chains returned the sound of another body part being slammed to the floor. And as the screams grew tired and the laughter faded to a closed-mouthed chuckle, he snapped from his ignorant fixation of the wall and turned in horror to sight the crippled and mutilated body of what was once a fully human form. A stumpy, abhorrent mess of amputated holes, a midriff that was now ripped and marked from the metal pulling against its struggle, and an exhausted, veiny, flaking head that was dropped semi-consciously from side to side, was all that remained of the subject. Its legs now tossed in the pile with the rest of its useless parts. Dr. Abbott had finished an even lazier job of breaking off these bones than he had done so with the arms, and the creature now sat half the stature of what it once was, only being held in place by the chains that gripped its torso. It is of interest to note that there's still no sign of blood from any of the newly created orifices, the doctor exclaimed. But what was of more frightening interest to Murphy was the fact that the corpse, throughout all of its torture and misery and suffering, was still smiling, wider than ever. It would appear that this thing is incredibly resilient, wouldn't you agree, Murphy? There's definitely something to be said for the constitution of the undead. They really cling on tight to the last remnants of life, don't they? But his assistant gave no answer, only staring him down with a familiar heart-aching look in his eyes. I know. You want this all to be over with. Well, fear not, friend, for I have only one final attempt to make. The doctor then raised his worn and milky blade, another grin shining on his evil face. But this time he tilted it horizontally so that the sharp point tip aimed directly for the creature's chest, in particular its heart. He positioned himself directly in line behind the weapon, and with a gallant charge, forced his way through the rib cage and the most vital organ of his victim. Dr. Abbott now stood still, inches from the face of his toy, and watched with ultimate pleasure as its full, extensive smile slowly slunk down to a pencil-thin line. He gazed in the eyes of the dying creature and marked the end of a beautiful hour together with a puckered, squeaking kiss for the air to enjoy. He slowly but painfully wriggled the blade out from the heart of his horrifically abused experiment, who no longer had the energy to wriggle, scream, or cry. And as the doctor threw his stained knife in the nearby sink, and Murphy observed, wide-eyed in the corner of the room, the humanoid being took its last beaten breath. "So," the doctor started, stripping off his tie and washing his calloused, murky hands, "I guess there are other methods of killing them then. Although I wouldn't think that anyone else would have the spare time to perform what we did." And he laughed. "Still, I've had worse dates in my life." And he motioned with his eyes for Murphy to smile, which he did not. "Anyway, let's see what you've got jotted down here. No doubt there will be a lot of notes to read through." The doctor stopped his words when reaching the pen and paper on his desk, for the page lay flat on the wood, still as blank as the moment he retrieved it from the drawer. "Murphy, didn't I tell you to write the notes throughout the experiment?" He crinkled the paper in his hands and walked over to his friend. "Here I am creating scientific history, and all I ask is that you write the notes. I need you to do as you're told. Do you understand?" Murphy didn't nod or shake his head. He could only stare down toward the ground and drag his feet back and forth, his limbs hanging loose at his sides, his eyes wandering vacantly. "Oh, I see. You must be running low on the serum. I forgot how long it had been since I last gave you your dosage. No harm on your part then, Murphy. I get so absorbed in my work sometimes that I lose track of the hours. You already know that though, don't you?" The doctor walked over to his assortment of lab equipment and picked up a long needle with an oddly vibrant purple goop that swished around inside the vial. "Come on over and sit in the chair. I'll get you fixed up good as new, old friend." For the lucky few who don't know what a red room is, let me explain. A red room is a place on the internet where murders are live-streamed for the internet's wandering eyes to see. Now, I myself have never sought after proof if these do in fact exist, and personally, I think it's all a hoax. The idea of someone secretly live-streaming a murder that is untraceable just sounds too ridiculous to be true. I'm no computer wizard or anything along those lines, but I would think that the police or the FBI would have the technology to track where these red rooms are being broadcasted from. I stood behind my opinion on red rooms, that is, until I started working as a night audit for a hotel about a month ago. And the one thing that I have learned from working here is that red rooms are very much real, and they're not as uncommon as you might think. Let me start from the beginning. I just graduated college in a rinky-dink bullshit degree that took too long to get, and now I have loans to pay, so I needed a full-time job as soon as friggin' possible. I chose to work at a hotel as a night audit third shift because the pay was decent, seemed fun, I'm a night owl already, and it was really the only thing available at the time. Plus, I've always enjoyed working in customer service, so a hotel job seemed like a perfect fit for me. When I went in for the interview, the first thing I noticed was that the hotel was beaten up to hell on the outside, but the inside was shockingly beautiful. The hardwood floors were new and shiny. The wallpaper was vibrant, and the entire space was well lit. It made me forget how awful the outside looked. As the saying goes, looks can be deceiving. And holy hell, wasn't that the case. I'll spare the back and forth chatter between the hiring manager and myself because I obviously got the job, or I wouldn't be writing this post in the first place. After 2 weeks of grueling computer and day shift training, I was finally ready to train with the current night auditor for a few nights to finish up the final bit of grunt work and earn the great title of an official front desk assistant. One thing I was going to have to get used to was being alone all night, since there really only needs to be one person at the front desk at a time during overnight shifts. So I was going to enjoy the company as much as I could. The job was simple enough, make sure everyone is checked in, run nightly reports, restock everything for the morning shift. Really, it was about 2 hours of work and 6 hours of standing around. Nights were already boring enough having 2 people doing night audit, so I was preparing myself for the many nights by my lonesome in the near future. My 4th week working at the hotel, and it was finally time to start my first night shift on my own. I came well prepared with my laptop, headphones, and a book. I ran through my checklist, making sure everyone was checked in, ran reports, set everything up for the next day. Now that I had about 5 hours to kill, I decided to make my rounds through the hotel, making sure everything that had a place was in its place. I didn't want my boss catching me slacking off my first night by myself. The owner likes to micromanage and watch the cameras at random times to make sure we're all doing our jobs. And yes, that includes 2 o'clock in the morning. One thing about the hotel I work at is it isn't that big. I'd say it's a normal-sized hotel with 3 floors, but the architecture and room layout is odd. Everything runs through the lobby. And what I mean by that is that the lobby and dining space are connected, and then it's one long hallway with the elevators in the middle. There are no corners. It's just a straight shot, shotgun house-styled hotel. As I'm walking through the 3rd floor, I began to hear muffled screaming and talking coming from one of the rooms I was walking past, which happened to be at the end of the hallway. I stopped to listen, but honestly thought nothing of it and chalked it up to their television being turned up too loud. We had a lot of phone call complaints from guests about other guests next to them having their televisions turned up too high. But really, it's because the walls are really thin. So I made my way back down to the front desk, preparing myself for a phone call from the guest next door to the room. But no phone call was made. I felt relieved because I really didn't want to deal with a noise complaint in the middle of the night. Those are never fun for anyone involved. I decided at this point it was time for me to bring out my laptop and watch some Netflix in the back room. But first I was going to check and see who was in the noisy room. That way we can inform them that the walls are really thin and not to have the television up that loud in the middle of the night. When I went in to check the reservation, it showed that there was no one checked into that room at all, but instead, that room was blocked off for maintenance. This discovery sent chills up my spine, because I knew for a fact there was definitely noise coming from that room. So I did the next logical thing and called up to the room. The phone rang for a solid minute before I finally decided to hang up and walk up to the room to check it out myself. What happened next? I wish I could forget. I slowly crept up to the room at the end of the 3rd floor and gently put my ear against the door. The sound I heard made my blood turn cold and my knees weak. It was the muffled scream again. A woman's scream, to be exact. But the more I listened, I realized that she was being gagged. I could hear the cries for her to try to escape her throat, but each time was stopped by whatever was blocking the airway. The sound was a mix between desperation and death. I'm not sure what death would even sound like, but if I had to describe it, it would be the exact sound of this woman's gagged screams. You know when something just absurd happens to you, and you choose to make the stupid decision instead of the logical one? Well, that's exactly what I did in this situation. My first reaction was not to call the police, but instead, it was to use the master room key and barge in without thinking. The smell was the first thing that hit me. The room reeked of urine, blood, vomit. I'm honestly surprised I didn't yak up my dinner all over the floor. The next thing I noticed was a naked, middle-aged woman, bound up by her hands and hanging from the ceiling, a sock shoved in her mouth, and duct tape holding it in place. Blood and feces covered her body. The look on her face said it all. She had been here for weeks. Her eyes glazed over, cuts all over her body and face. I was so focused on her and the fear she had in her eyes that I almost didn't notice the camera in the corner of the room recording not just her, but now it was also recording me. I froze in fear, knowing damn well that whoever was recording this knows who I am now. So what did I do next? I ran. I ran down the stairs, down the hall, out to my car, and drove as far away from that fucking hotel as I could. Luckily, there was no one else in that room. But I know whoever was filming their fucked up snuff film will find me eventually. I might have escaped the hotel, but I know this is far from over. I witnessed a red room in action, and there's no fucking way I'm gonna get off with a free pass here. So now, I guess